Hi, my name is Vetchodash. I'm one of the founders of LCA Spotlight, that stands for Learning Content Accessibility Spotlight, and we're a community and a newsletter helping learning content creators create more accessible training or learn about the accessibility standards. And this is one of our guest spotlights, and I'm really excited about that because we have Susi Miller with us, who is like the e-learning accessibility expert. She's the author of this book that is like my Bible, as you can see. It's very, very useful because she translates the WCAG guidelines into our language, and that's kind of what prompted creating the LCA Spotlight as well. So thank you, Susi, for joining us. And
thank you.
If you could introduce yourself even better, that would be cool.
Yes, thank you so much. Yeah, and just to start off with, just saying what a wonderful, organisation you are, wonderful community you are. So you're doing a brilliant job. So just to extend my thanks. My background really is having probably, ever since I started working, being in learning and development. So started off as a classroom teacher, and then moved into IT training, and then kind of fell into instructional design and doing e-learning content. So I probably the same as quite a lot of people. So for about over probably 30 years now, I've been involved in the L&D sort of arena in that space. So I think from the accessibility point of view, my kind of journey started when I was really lucky. I was actually working in an organisation which was kind of in the public sector. So I had the opportunity to ask people for feedback. So we didn't have kind of proper usability testing, but we had the opportunity to get people to feedback. So the very first piece of learning content that I created, piece of e-learning I created, I had someone who was a screen reader user who fed back to me that she couldn't use, absolutely no way that she could use my learning content. And at the time I had no idea really what a screen reader was. So I was really, really lucky that she sort of showed me her experience of using the learning content. And for me, that was one of the bugs that made me realize how important it was to kind of find out more about accessibility, and really got me started with it.
So cool. And then you do talk about it a little bit in your book as well, like the things that made you realize things. And you also do a lot of audits nowadays, work with companies, helping them improve their training. So that's what we're here to talk about, really, the things that you come across that we might forget or we might know, but we might not fix them properly. So that's what we'll be talking about, the things that you come across.
Perfect.
So where shall we start? do you have a list to go through, or shall we just start with one of them? So what's the most common thing that you notice or
Yeah, so I suppose the kind of like the introduction to the work that we've done with audits and the training that we've done, I suppose, is for me, it's a kind of a progression on from where I was when I wrote the book. So it's that kind of the quote of sort of doing the best you can, and then when you find out more, sort of doing better. So I know when I wrote the book, that imposter syndrome I continuously was facing, in thinking actually this is just really my experience and my interpretation of the standards, and I only had that to fall back on, and working with a few kind of colleagues. And I think I've been really, really privileged since starting up my own company, starting up Ella Hub, to have worked with a huge range of different organisations, and that are spanning, all different sectors, all small organisations, huge international organisations, etc., and public, private, charity sector as well. And I think that has given me such a such a privilege to be able to see accessibility, not only the things that people are struggling with, but actually to see it come out on the other side. So to see inaccessible content which has been audited, and then it's been kind of improved, or it's been made more accessible, kind of seeing practitioners who have started off really not knowing too much about accessibility, and then going through the training and implementing it, really has been such a positive experience for me. And so kind of affirming that actually making learning content accessible, not only if you find out about making learning content accessible, improves your practice as a practitioner, but actually it absolutely 100%, hand on heart improves the learning for everybody. So yes, it makes it accessible for people who have access needs, but the knock-on effect of making your learning content accessible is just huge. Just the whole, and for me that was, many different light bulbs, but eventually, goodness, actually this, I can categorically say that all the learning content I've seen that's been kind of improved from an accessibility point of view is so much better for all learners. And for me that was kind of, as I say, sort of the light bulb moment. I thought, actually, yes, it is. I now have proof that actually this is what I thought was the case when I was writing the book. Actually, we've got so many kind of examples of how that is the case. So I think that's kind of what the one side of it from what I've learned. I think the other thing is still, and partly that probably, kind of ties in a little bit more with your mission and what you're doing in your community, is the fact that it is still difficult to be, making content compliant, making it accessible to the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. So I suppose the learning that I deliver a course on designing and developing learning, accessible learning content, and that course has, I suppose, evolved as we've been doing. The more audits we've been doing, the more we've been training people, the easier it is then to pull out the things that really are causing issues. So it was really kind of you to say that the book tries to explain things in plain language, which so that's a good starting point. But when it comes to the kind of what I call the nitty gritty of actually applying those standards to what we're trying to do and putting it in the context of making it a good learning experience. So we've talked many times about the fact that those guidelines are really meant for web development, really, rather than people who are designing kind of websites, e-commerce or informational, not really aimed at what we're doing as learning designers and developers. So there's things in them that are kind of universally applicable and really easily make sense to what we're doing in all digital content, but there are some standards that we really have to kind of interpret what we're doing, and sometimes it's just it comes down to just a judgment call. So and for me that's probably the area where I see sometimes even when people are you say that that I'm the expert, which is a really lovely thing to say, but I think as everybody knows that there is no such thing as being an expert really either in accessibility, because it's it's changing and learning. You have to be learning all the time, but particularly when you're trying to apply it to learning content, because we're having to kind of make it fit to what we're doing, and ultimately what we're doing is trying to make a really good learning experience for people. So that's I suppose that the real key thing to sort of an overarching sort of learning from working with lots of organizations, and that really then, as I say, has made me realize that the particular, especially doing the audits that we see, is that even, for example, when people have done training, that's brilliant, and then they apply the training and they make the content as accessible as possible, but then there's still issues that we see coming up in audits, and those are the ones that's really easy then to key point to kind of highlight, that are either difficult to understand the context, or they're difficult to apply. So I can give you a whole list of them if you like.
Okay, I was just jotting down more questions in the meantime.
But yes, I'm just aware that you asked me one and I answered something completely different. So
no, we can start that. But I have more. So
okay,
just like a side note, do you feel like companies are improving in terms of do you see better content coming to you for audit in terms of accessibility? Like, is there a trend that they're getting better?
I think the fact that people are doing it at all and are coming to ask for help is a hugely positive step in the right direction. I would say, a few years ago, it was really, it was fairly uncommon for people to even realize maybe that their learning content came under these digital accessibility guidelines, and we should be making our learning content accessible for everyone. So that's a real step in the right direction. And I think obviously the people that are kind of coming to us are people that know that they need help. So it's kind of that they're at the beginning of the learning journey, really. So a lot of the audits we see, a lot of the organizations we work with realize that actually they do need a lot of they need support. So I would say it's not like when we see audits that we say, oh, actually this is 100% accessible. We haven't quite discovered that yet, but actually quite often I think the audits that are given to us, people know that they are accessibility issues and they want help in kind of deciding where they are, kind of thing. But as I say, for me the real positive is organizations being aware and realizing how important it is, and that is a real change, I think.
Yeah, definitely. There's a lot of conversation going around accessibility these days, which is really nice to see.
I agree,
in terms of your process, what I wanted to ask is like your process must be really meticulous, and then you do a lot of things to test. But is there like a standard that you aim for, like an AA standard and an AAA, or you are doing it completely differently and you just go for user experience?
Okay, that's a really good question. So the way when we do our auditing, we have kind of various different options. And generally, the kind of standard audit we do is what we call an overview audit. And that is looking at AA compliance mainly. So generally, most organizations are trying to work to AA compliance. And, from a legal point of view, that's generally the underpinning standard, or if it's not necessarily the legal underpinning standard, it's usually the kind of best practice. People realize that's what they should be aiming for. Interestingly, from the point of view of just on a standard point of view, two things really. One of the first thing is that, again, when we're looking at applying those standards, when we're looking at a good learner experience, a good user experience, then some of the web content accessibility guidelines, which are particularly helpful, are actually at AAA standards. So things, for example, like showing your learners where they are in the learning wouldn't necessarily be something that's a AAA standard. So that isn't something that's necessarily key for someone who's doing a website. I mean, it's always helpful, but it's not. Whereas for me, the process of learning content and signposting learners to where they are is a fundamental. It's part of good instructional design, but that is a kind of a AAA recommendation. And there's lots of guidance and advice which isn't necessarily a kind of a black and white WCAG standard. So what we do in our audits is we will do the kind of overview. We will look at all of the standards and see if they're being compliant, but then we will have a section, and for me that's almost just as important, is what we call the kind of the learner experience and the inclusive, it's usability and inclusive kind of section. And in there we put all the kind of things that we recommend makes a better user experience for all learners, but also for learners who are using assistive technology. So that will be the kind of AAA recommendations. It will also be things like maybe some more of the kind of formatting and use of capital letters and things like that aren't necessarily a kind of defined, because the issue with the WCAG standard as well, that we're all aware, they're pass or fail criteria, so they have to be really rigid in if you're meeting them. Now, from when we're applying kind of them holistically to a good learner experience, there's so many recommendations which are the AAA guidelines and other recommendations which make it a better user experience. And there's also that overlap, I always think, with inclusivity. So for me, that the difference between the accessible and the inclusive is the accessible is more the kind of, yes, we're making sure we're ticking every single box. The inclusivity side of it is making sure that all learners feel welcome and considered and included. So it's things like, for me, providing an accessibility statement, making sure that you're using plain language, using inclusive language as well, that idea of, the click and the select, or making sure that you're using, which isn't a WCAG standard, but it's just something that is showing that you're aware that that everybody is not maybe accessing the content in the same way. So so things that are making everybody feel that like they're, that you want them to have a good learner experience and that you've thought about them and you've considered them. For me, that then is the kind of extra bit on the kind of audits we do. But there's also the issue as well with audits is that when it comes to the idea of testing, when you say, you have a strict, which we do, but what we do with the overview audits is that concept that actually there's quite a lot of WCAG standards which are kind of reliant on technical coding. So we kind of offer that the overview audit, if we're using an overview audit and we're auditing against a tool that has a voluntary product accessibility template or a conformance report, then we will rely on that to say, you know, we're not going to go in and look at the underlying coding and make sure it works, because if our clients want that, then we will, you know, we'll work with our technical partners who will do that. But generally, and for me, that's a really key thing in the idea of making accessibility accessible, because if you have got that kind of conformance report that you can look at, now they are sometimes, you know, they can be a bit subjective, so accessibility experts say, you know, be cautious with them. But if you've got a good organization with a good conformance report or VPAT, then you can actually look at that yourself and see whether the tool is compliant without having to then find either an accessibility expert in your organization or someone external. So for me, that's this idea of democratizing accessibility, so that accessibility becomes something that we all have responsibility for, and that we can all test. You know, we can all see whether our content is accessible, is a really kind of, you know, an interesting, and again, it's something that we kind of discovered along the way, you know. So it's not always everybody can do bits of testing themselves. You don't have to be an accessibility expert to do that. So that's a kind of another thing with our, as you say, our table of things that we're checking against. So that's our kind of our approach, really.
That's really interesting, because, you know, when we, like you mentioned, that not all of the, like, this is written for web developers, the WCAG guidelines are written for web developers, and then some of them apply to us, some of them don't apply to us, some of them should apply to us more, as you said, the AAA standards, we should just do standard things. And I remember, like, there have been a few spotlights when we went to you and we were like, how do we ensure that? Because the authoring tools themselves are responsible for ensuring that. So it's like, you need to know sometimes what you can do and what you can't do, and what you need to check the compliance, the conformance report.
Completely agree.
Okay, so shall we go through the list of, like, what the issues are, what the most common issues are, so we can
I've got this list, I've got it written down here. Let me look at my little notes down here. Okay, so I think probably the most, so these kind of, like, there's about 10 of them, and I'll just run through them quickly. So it's really the one that we come across probably the most often is still issues with color contrast. So that can be color contrast between the text and the background, and color contrast for things like graphical objects or user interface components, which are generally buttons. So there's two contrast ratios for different ones for both of those. The first one is the 4.5 to 1, and the second one is the 3 to 1. And I think the 3 to 1, the kind of graphical objects are things like if you've got a table, for example, and it's got a table, or if you've got, you know, a graph, or, you know, it can be a pie chart. A lot of people aren't aware that was a kind of a 2.1. So some people aren't aware that there is that color contrast ratio, not only between the elements in the background, but also between adjacent elements. So that's where people get tripped up quite a lot if they've got lots of kind of graphical you know, information in their content. And then buttons as well, because they're user interface elements, they need to be that 3 to 1 contrast ratio against their background. And then they've also got the 4.5 to 1, depending on the size of the text, against the background itself. So that can be quite complicated to get your head around when you're kind of working on the buttons. So I think that's one of the reasons for that. But from the text to the background, I think, and again, this was a bit of a light bulb moment working with organizations, is we quite often see, it's very often the reason is because an organization will have a brand palette that they're working towards, and that's really, really common. And so what people are often given is like, okay, this is our brand palette, this is what you need to stick to. What they don't have, so then they can go in and they can double check, you know, that their text is meeting the background contrast, you know, with all the color contrast checkers that people are aware of. But what we found recently is what can be really, really helpful is if you've got kind of a matrix. So the issue about color contrast ratio is that it's the difference between two colors. So if you've just got a brand palette that says use these colors and doesn't tell you you can use this color and this coloring, or you can use this combination and this combination, but you can't use that combination and that combination, that's generally what we find is causing the problem. So people are trying to use the brand palette, but they haven't been given any guidance on actually it's the combination of these two colors that you can use to make it accessible, and these ones you can't. So we found recently a color contrast checker, which you put all your brand colors in, and then it gives you a lovely matrix, and it says, right, you can use these and these. So that for me would be like a huge step in the right direction for organizations, because it just takes out that sort of that extra one step of, oh, I've got to check if I'm using that yellow with that black, or or that orange with the white. I have to make sure that that it is accessible with my, every time I'm going to have to check. If you just had an organization had like a this is your accessible palette and you can use these colors together, that would make a huge difference. So I can give you the link for that. Lovely.
Oh, that would be great. I have one as well, so I was just
Okay.
writing down to share it, definitely. That's actually also interesting. I just want to mention two things. One is that I have worked with companies where none of the colors went together.
Okay.
And then you had to use the brand guidelines, and you had to be very clever about like how you create color contrast. So sometimes there are color palettes that are just not going to work. And then the second thing I wanted to mention is that, interestingly, sometimes you pass, like we had our branding, the LCA branding, we created the blue to work with. Well, it passes both the white and the black contrast. But we recently discovered we were using the blue and the black together, and it was just not visible enough. Like, we have actually passed the requirement, but not the eye test. So it's also important to like use common sense as well on top of.
I agree with you. Yeah. And to be fair, there's a huge, it's one of those things in accessibility. It's a bit like different types of fonts. There's a huge discussion about we shouldn't be using these, we shouldn't be using this, we should be using different, is it matrix? A different way of basically measuring the difference between the two. So but for me that's interesting, but I think you just have to sometimes be pragmatic, and you just need to start somewhere. So at the moment, yes, they're not, I completely agree with you, they're not ideal, and sometimes I'm really surprised if I do an audit. Sometimes I look at color contrast and I go, absolutely no way that's going to pass, and then it does. As you say. And I think, okay. But I think that you need a starting point. So maybe in the future we will be measuring it in a different way, and it will be a bit more sophisticated. But I always think, when people start sort of discussing, that's brilliant, great to have that. But actually, you have to start somewhere. You have to say, I at least I've got a fairly good idea that this is kind of a good contrast. But as I say, obviously on top of that, you put common sense, and whether actually you think it visually is good as well is a good, really good tip. Yeah.
Okay. What's the second one?
And the second one, is also on colour. So these are in no particular order. I probably grouped them in sort of, fitting together and kind of making sense. So quite often what we see on in learning content is colour alone used. So if it's especially for feedback. So because of what we're doing as learning designers and developers, we quite often will be, well, that's one of the things that we do for knowledge checks and assessments and quiz questions, is we give feedback, and quite often we'll see that maybe just a colour overlay is used. So like a red on the kind of and a green on that, yes, you've got it right, and a red on actually no, this isn't, that you haven't got this right. And that obviously is an issue for people who have got colour vision deficiency or who are colour blind. So we see that quite a lot on feedback. And sometimes I've seen a great example recently actually of a drag and drop where obviously the issue with drag and drop, we'll talk about in a minute, but also that dragging, what happened was when you dragged and dropped the things into the right place into the Venn diagram or the wrong place, they changed color. And again, that idea of putting to testing that using the grayscale test is something that we cover kind of on training, but it's a really quick way of checking to see whether you're using color alone, because although that kind of monochrome color blind deficiency, that color vision deficiency is quite rare. For us as a way of testing, that idea of democratizing testing and having a look at things that you can do to easily test, just changing your visuals, your feedback, your graphs, and changing them to grayscale. And if you can't actually get that information because there's only color that's defining something or giving that information, that's a really great indication that you're failing that particular standard. Another one we see quite a lot is when people are using links. So if they sometimes just define a link in that I don't know, again, sometimes it can be a branding thing, but they take the underlining off. That then means that a link is only distinguished by the color of the text. And again, sometimes that can be really difficult for people with who are colorblind or have got color vision deficiency to actually see the difference between the two. So that's another thing that we come across. Lots of issues with links.
Okay. That is actually interesting. So you're basically saying that if you have link in the text, never take out the underlining. That makes sense, right? That's what you're saying.
That's the kind of interpretation of that color alone. Because if you, I've got some like really great examples of people doing that, and I've seen recently actually an example where they use the same color for the heading on the page and then for the links. So it was like, well, how do I know? Because there was no underline, how do I know that this is a link? And I mean sometimes like visually you could see that something was a heading, but halfway down the links weren't links, and it was kind of, is that because it's a heading or because you've forgotten to attach the link to it? So it's that kind of it's the confusion. And again, if you change that to grayscale, quite often that's very similar to the text around is a very similar color. So someone who has, you've got no guarantee that someone who is colorblind would be able to actually distinguish that at all. And
you need to have the color contrast as well with the text and
that's
the
true.
link
Yes,
itself.
yes,
yeah. And then the other thing that you mentioned that I had not thought about, we did write a spotlight on it. We called it complementing colors.
Okay.
But this is something that I had not thought of then. Are you saying basically that if you have sometimes in e-learning you have those images and then you click on them and they become disabled because you have visited them, or they take on that stage of visited and they become monochrome or like black and white, grayscale? Are you saying that is an accessibility issue then?
So, and that's one of the, again, where we could go dive into the complexities of the web content accessibility guidelines, because a lot of them have exceptions around them. And one of the exceptions to that color contrast is if it's an interactive item, but it's basically not active, then the color contrast doesn't apply. So if it's an inactive button, then actually you're absolutely right. Then the color contrast requirements don't apply. If it's a state of a button and that button is still active, that's one that catches people out sometimes as well. Then the states actually clearly in the guidelines say every state of the button, if it's active, it does need to comply to those regulations. So that can sometimes catch people out if they've got an authoring tool that gives them inbuilt buttons with different states on them. Some of the states, not necessarily, it's always worth double checking all of the states on that button as it's active to make sure that they all comply with that color contrast ratio and those requirements. But if you're absolutely right, if it's an inactive button, then it doesn't apply.
Okay. All right.
Hidden in the exceptions.
Yeah, there are some exceptions.
There are.
Okay, yes. I'm conscious of the time, so
okay, no problem.
Shall we move on to the next one?
Yes, no problem. I'll run through these quite quickly. So
No, let's not do it quickly. I just want to make sure that we can still go through the 10 and then finish on time, but take as long as we need.
Okay. So another huge one is captions. So either videos not having captions at all, or the captions are people provide a transcript instead of captions because they think that will tick the accessibility box. So the transcript can be helpful, but there's kind of key requirements about the captions that they should be synchronized. So you're trying to provide an equivalent experience. So that's why captions need to be synchronized to the actual to the video content. So that's really important. Descriptive as well. We sometimes see that the things that are missing from captions are things like generally, if there's more than one speaker, those tend to be identified, but that's something that you could possibly miss. Things like sound effects are quite often missed. And a really, really important one we quite often see if you're doing things like, when you're doing sort of staff development and you maybe have got we quite often have videos where you're kind of learning and you've got a scenario, and sometimes, if things are being conveyed by the tone of people's voices. So that is the type of thing that we quite often see missed out of captions. And if you think about it, you always have to think from a captions point of view, because it gets a little bit confusing with all of our different, requirements that we have around video. But if you're thinking about captions, again, you're thinking about what will somebody not, you need to make sure that you're giving someone equivalent experience. So what will they be missing if they're not hearing, the fact that someone's beginning to, sound a bit irritated. And that's a really key thing if you're trying to kind of get them to kind of really take part in the scenario. So we quite often see that. And then a huge one is accuracy. So in organizational content, we very, very often see external videos used, which is fine, but those, if you have got a video that's got auto captions on it, often they are created by the platform like YouTube, for example. They will not be accurate, they will not have punctuation in them, and they will have lots of mistakes in them. And accuracy is actually one of the requirements of that WCAG standard, because again, you're trying to give someone an equivalent experience. And if you are trying to process that content and it's got errors in it and it's got no punctuation, that really isn't giving someone an equivalent experience. So that's a real key one for captions. So we see that one a lot. Okay. And then closely linked to that one, unless you had a question, sorry.
No, I didn't. That was very straightforward. Okay, the others were too. I just had more questions about that.
No worries. Yeah, but it's always good to be questioned, because sometimes you think, I have to double check that, but I think that's right. Anyway, so the other one linked very often with video content is this idea of audio description or a transcript. So and again, what you're thinking, and then people quite often get confused between, well, why am I if I'm providing captions, why do I need to do that? So it's the idea of a different access need that you're basically including. So the idea of audio description is that you're providing those visual cues that somebody will miss. So I think most people are kind of familiar with maybe seeing audio description on kind of the on the TV programs that we might watch. Sometimes it pops up, in our options, but it's that you thinking of this, if the video has got important visual content, somebody who is blind or has low vision will not be able to access that. So the way that an easy way to check that is to watch a video and then maybe turn away or close your eyes. And if you are not getting an equivalent experience, if you're missing the visual content, that is really important that is being conveyed in meaning, then you need to consider having audio description or a descriptive transcript which provides that. And I could go on all day about the difference between the two, and I won't. And the kind of, whether you're meeting it at AA or AAA or A requirement, because that's probably quite complicated. But at the very, even if you are not able as an organisation to provide audio description, because that is probably, something else to discuss, providing a descriptive transcript is your kind of, for me, always the best practice. If you can do nothing else, provide a descriptive transcript. And not only does that then cater for people who are blind or have got low vision, it also caters for people who are deaf-blind, because the only way that they can access video content is through a descriptive transcript, which is actually translated or converted into Braille display. So, or one of the key ways. So that's for me is a real, a pragmatic solution sometimes to this idea of whether we should be providing audio description, extended audio description or standard audio description, which again I could do a whole hour on. Actually, I think Diane covered it, didn't she? She was looking at it.
Yeah, I'm scared to ask questions. But just quickly, if I may, you're saying that transcripts are more of a priority than audio descriptions.
Okay, so that's probably not as strictly true. So if you are, again, if you're trying to meet the kind of the level that you're trying to meet, basically the AA requirement is that you provide audio description. So that audio description is a descriptive transcript, a descriptive audio track, and you quite often you see the extended. So the kind of standard audio description is when there's enough gaps in between the dialogue and the action that you can actually describe what's happening in the audio track. The extended one is where you have to pause because you've got longer then to it. So from the standard point of view, you should be providing at AA, you should be providing audio description. So again, some organizations that we've worked with, I said, we work with a whole range of organizations that they're sometimes just not able to logistically do that. So if that's not possible for your organization for whatever reason, then if you provide a descriptive transcript, so it's almost like a script that you've got there, that is the kind of, you're at least giving someone an equivalent, rather than not providing anything at all.
Mm-hmm.
And the advantage of that is also that it benefits people with different access needs as well. So, you've got your cognitive access needs. Some people find it difficult to process moving content, for example. So it and as I say, it also covers people who are using Braille, refreshable Braille displays as well.
Yeah, I just hear more and more people consuming podcasts in transcript format, because it's just easier to skim through the content and find what you're looking for.
Yeah, that whole discussion on preferences. Yeah.
Going back to the audio description, just a quick one. It's because the AA standard requires that you add audio description if there are pauses in the content. So you don't need to edit the video itself to add those. The extended audio description is more like a AAA standard. I'm just thinking, most of the videos that I see, at least in training, is a script written with no pauses, and then you create the visuals to that. So I haven't really noticed that much of a need of an extended audio description or the possibility to do audio description. Have you come across a lot of videos in training content where extended audio description was needed, and what kind of videos were they?
Yeah, so I think that idea of the kind of the pauses, whether if there's pauses there and you can add it in, I think that's when you kind of look into if you're sort of looking at the wording, and it can be kind of interpreted in different ways. So for me, if you're giving someone an equivalent learning experience, then really you should be describing all of that content to them. So for me is I certainly see a lot of videos, maybe not necessarily videos where I think you're talking about kind of systems training. Was that what you were thinking of? So certainly a lot of the content that we see will be kind of content created by organizations, or it will be the external videos as well, where actually there is a lot of important visual information that somebody will be missing, and you may not be in a position, if it's an external video that someone else is using, to be able to add audio content to that. You can sometimes add an audio track. So I've seen that done as well, where it's an audio track where it's kind of a separate audio track where you've got the soundtrack, and then you've got people, the narrator describing the vision. But if you can't do that, that's where I think the descriptive transcript really comes into its own. So there is a lot of that's one where there's lots of interpretation, lots of people disagree on exactly what you should be doing. So I would say it's kind of, I always think that if you're thinking, actually, if I've got this video content, there's a reason I'm using this video content. I want to provide everybody with the same experience. How am I going to do that? And what's the most, practical and pragmatic way that I can do that? And it might not necessarily always tick the WCAG standard, or it might, someone, an accessibility expert may disagree with your interpretation of the standard, but ultimately you're thinking about, okay, how am I going to provide someone with an equivalent experience?
Okay, so this is one of those examples where you can comply with the AA standards, but it's better to go beyond that and provide a good learning experience.
Yeah. And so, as you say, sometimes if you're in the position where you are creating learning content, if you're creating a video content, that for me, we're quite often, we think about this idea of making our learning content accessible up front. We're thinking about accessibility, but we kind of think it as, with video content, we think of it as an afterthought very often. Even if we're not thinking of as an afterthought anymore about our learning content. So if you are in the position where you're creating learning content, if you think about accessibility up front, you can create a script that allows you to have the pauses, that allows you've got the narrator speaking. You don't have to then go back and think, oh goodness, I've got all this visual content which I now need to describe. So now I'm going to have to go back and re-edit that video and put in that put in the description. So it's that idea of thinking of I call it blueberry muffin video production, because it's like that analogy of the blueberry muffin where you don't, I don't know if you know that one, but you don't stick the blueberries in at the end of yeah. So that's why if you think about accessibility up front, and the issue is that we're not always doing that. We're not always in the position where we're producing videos. We're using kind of other video content, and that's where the complexity comes in, I think.
Yeah, and that Diane Elkins talked about it in our last spotlight as
you
well,
did,
like
yes,
how we
heard
can
that,
write
yeah.
scripts
Brilliant.
in that way. Oh, you watched that, great.
Yeah,
okay, what's the fifth one then?
Fifth one, yes, inaccessible interactions. So still see a lot of interactions, quiz questions that are mainly they're not keyboard accessible and not screen reader accessible. So things like drag and drops, matching, anything that you need to drag and drop, and that they're, our approach to that is if you use those, if there's a good learning reason to use them, then if you provide an accessible alternative, that's absolutely fine. But lots of organizations are still not really aware that some quiz options are, quiz questions are not accessible, so they don't provide an alternative, and that clearly is an issue. And in the new 2.2 ones, there is now a specific drag and drop standard, so that's a really handy one as well.
Okay, that was easy. Number 6.
Moving content without pause, stop, or hide. So lots of that kind of, it sort of reminds me of I've put this in because it's visually interesting, absolutely fine. But if you've got moving content, it can be a GIF, it can be it can be anything that's moving. If it's meeting the kind of specific WCAG requirements, learners do have to be able to pause, stop, or hide it, and that quite often is not the case for moving content that we see. So if as I say, there's actually like quite specific requirements to what applies to this, but it's this idea of people with cognitive access needs and actually all learners being given the control over anything that could be distracting and moving, and we see quite a lot of moving content.
Just briefly, what are the most common examples? Are they GIFs or voiceover?
They are quite often, quite often we see, especially now with a lot of tools have kind of media libraries that you can sort of use decorative. So it can be things like decorative videos, for example, are in the background of a slide, where, a good example that I've got, and actually that I used before I realized, is it's like a globe turning in the background for something, an introduction to a course. So it's basically any content where you're trying to process the information, but that content is happening in the background. So videos, kind of decorative videos are really common. GIFs as well, we quite often see being used. So, which is understandable. We're using this to try and make our content interesting and visually engaging, but which is fine. The idea is we're not stripping that out, but we are just giving people the opportunity to control that if it is distracting, particularly, in this case where you are trying to process content and there might be something. I'm certainly I'm dyslexic, and certainly for me, moving content is one of the most difficult things for me. If I've got anything happening, I just can't process that. It just shuts down my which is is one of my challenges, is processing content anyway. So if it's got something moving in the background or in my vision, then that causes me huge issues. So that's one that we see quite a lot.
Okay.
Then I've got alt text. Either it's not added at all, or and a really common one is that it's not. If it's a decorative image, people forget to hide it. So you get the poor screen reader. We've got a lovely screen reader tester who has to sit through JPEG 3.4.7.3 because someone hasn't hidden that image. So that's really common, and it is a it is a WCAG violation, but it's also, that again, when you're doing an audit, you have to be, we very rarely, in fact, we never will say, actually, in our opinion, this is a decorative image, or sorry, it's like we never say or there's that kind of grey area between you're the designer and the developer, then you kind of you're just deciding what these images are and whether they're providing meaning. So we don't kind of go in depth and saying, oh, actually, we might we might give a recommendation, but from the point of view of that, of having clearly, you know, a hidden text, a sort of an image which is only used for decoration and someone hasn't switched off the alt text, that's a really, really common one. And a really common one with someone is sometimes in some tools you'll have kind of an icon and it's made up of like 25 different free form shapes, and someone hasn't, they might have tried to switch off the kind of, but there's actually underneath that is free form shapes get announced by the screen reader because you need to separately turn them all off. So that's another one. Our screen reader tester sometimes will say, oh my god, is it what 15 free form 1, free form 3, free form, they're never in the correct order either. So yeah, that's another pet hate that she has.
Okay, so it's more of an issue of the decorative images rather than writing the alt text.
Yeah, I mean, if someone has, you know, if someone clearly knows about alternative text and has added their alternative text to the image, then generally, you know, they've done a pretty good job of that. It's usually the kind of not hide, you know, just forgetting or not being aware of the concept of alternative text at all, which is quite we do sometimes see.
Interesting.
Okay. And then we've got inaccessible links. So we still see, we were talking about the underlining issue earlier, we still see a lot of the click here kind of links, which can be accessible as long as the text surrounding that link is, so from an A point of view, if you've got a link and it's clear on the text surrounding that link where that link is going to take them, that would pass that standard. However, best practice is to put the text itself in the link, and that then means that someone who's using a screen reader, and actually everybody has a better learner experience, but particularly screen readers who use what we call an elements list, and they can sometimes jump from link to link. They can navigate using the elements list in their screen reader. Now, even if you meet the requirement which says yes, you can have a link that, for example, says click here, and the information is in the surrounding text which tells you where it should go, someone using the elements list is going to have click here, click here, click here, click here, click here. So it's always better to meet that. That's another example of the AAA requirement is what we consider to be, or what we advise is best practice, because it's best practice. You know, it's best practice if you're a visual learner, because you can just see clearly in the text of the link itself where you're going to go, rather than having to sort of search in the surrounding text. So it's a good.
And that's such an easy fix anyway.
Sorry,
that's such an easy fix anyway.
Yeah, that's a good one. That one. Yeah.
Once you get into the habit of it, you will not right click here anymore.
You won't.
Yeah.
Or you won't put a full URL. We have, you know, it's surprising, but you do sometimes see full URLs, you know, like really long, used as well. But less, the click here is the one that we see more.
Okay. All right, we're on number 9 now.
Are we on number 9? Okay.
I think so.
Yeah, the next one is heading styles. So for screen reader users, having the heading styles correctly programmed in so that they know if there's a heading 1, a heading 2, a heading 3 is absolutely so fundamental for someone who's using a screen reader to understand the structure of the page and also to be able to navigate that content. So it's really key. I mean, sometimes generally if you're using kind of more template driven tools, that's all automatically done for you, but in some what we call the open kind of control tools, you sometimes need to go and apply those heading styles like you would in a Word document, and that's very often forgotten, and sometimes it can be the limitation of the tool, but it's that idea of having that hierarchical structure. So obviously within the structure you can have different heading levels as long as they're kind of clearly, you know, in the hierarchy, but we quite often see like a heading level 5 followed by a heading, you know, level 3, and it's just, but what that means, the kind of impact that has on someone who's using a screen reader, or I never really, you know, understood again until I worked with a screen reader tester, was that they then feel like they're missing content, because if I'm jumping, if it's not a hierarchical structure that I can understand, have I missed something? You know, is my screen, because obviously you have no visual, you know, people who are blind will have no visual indication of you know what's happening on the page. So a lot of people who use screen readers do have low vision and can see, you know, but actually, you know, to make it logical for everybody, that heading structure is really important.
On that, I have a question. So
Yeah.
that's my favorite thing, by the way, because I know
Okay.
that I was so guilty of that. I was like, oh, I'm just going to format the heading, make it look like a heading, and didn't care that
Yeah.
there was
Yeah.
like a
So was
heading
I.
tag.
So were we all.
So I now know that. But is that true that if you like the first one should always be a heading 1, and after that it should always be a heading 2? Or can you like not jump around like you said 5 and 1, but can you jump around like 1, 3, 5 in that order?
Again, it is sometimes you just need to look at the context of why it's being used, and there probably are case scenarios where it might be that you've got subheadings, and they're kind of like underneath, so that could be a possibility. But generally, yeah, it's difficult to know without seeing the kind of case scenario of when you would be using it. So again, there's the kind of and again, when you're talking about a visual hierarchy, if you've got a visual hierarchy, so you can see from a visual, as you say, you're applying maybe a color to a particular heading, and then but your hierarchy is, so your heading 2 font might be bigger than your heading 1, or maybe your heading 5 font might be bigger than your heading 3 font. That again is an issue when it comes to kind of making that logical. So I'm not sure if that's really answering that question. It's that the idea of the hierarchy that somebody can hear on the screen reader matching the visual hierarchy. So that might point you in the direction of whether when you're applying them, whether that's whether that helps you, whether there is a case where you can use those.
Okay, so if it's just that I think like sometimes you think that some headings are bigger than they should be, like your heading
Okay.
1 is going to be the biggest, then you go for like a heading 2 and you're like, this is huge. So you
Okay.
go for a heading 5 and you skip 2, 3, and 4.
Okay. Okay, so that I see, because you have no control over the font that is being used for that heading. Okay, so yes, that would be an issue. If you were literally skipping levels, then that would definitely be an issue. So if you're in the ideal position that you have control over those heading levels, that's when you would go in and you would change you'd be changing the formatting so that they would then not be huge. But yeah, that's a good question. Yeah.
Good to know. And we're on the last one, I think.
The last one is probably images of text. We see a lot. So again, that images of text for us is it's a bit of a grey area, not really grey area. So from the point of view of the WCAG standards, there's very specific instances where you can use an image of text. So the issue with images of text is that they are inaccessible for lots of different access needs. So they're not picked up if you've got basically an image which has text in it, that isn't picked up by a screen reader. It's also an issue if someone's using screen magnification, because quite often when they magnify, that will then pixelate, be difficult to read. And it's also an issue for people with cognitive access needs who use different third-party tools, quite often browser plugins, to actually make the font accessible for them, so they change the color, and that you cannot do that. You cannot bespoke or make you can't actually change the font if it's part of an image. So that for lots of reasons, that's why images of text is something that you should be avoiding from an accessibility point of view. However, when we're doing audits, quite often people are using images of text because they're maybe it's part of a hybrid learning solution, and they're using these images in other places, or it's maybe part of the like an infographic that's used throughout the organization. So there's sometimes a clear reason, and they are not able to create that using the authoring tool that they're using. So for us, our approach to ourselves to using images of text is actually, if you're providing a text description of that image, but you're making sure that you're making it as descriptive as possible. So for example, if it was an infographic which was showing kind of a process, a cyclical process, that you actually describe that, and then you providing that for everybody. So not just putting it in the alternative text, so providing it as sometimes we will put it on a separate layer, or we'll put it in an accordion block, or maybe in a tab. Then everybody has access to that. For us, that is a way of if you say absolutely no images of text should ever be used at all, then that really is, you're stripping out a lot of the use that the people will use it. And again, there's exceptions to actually you can use in this type of thing. But again, when you're looking at the this is one sort of scenario where they, actually what we're doing in learning, we're often using infographics and kind of images of text which are used. So it's not wanting to strip everything out from an accessibility point of view, but providing an alternative. So that's our interpretation really of images of text. As long as there's a clear, accessible descriptive alternative that everybody can access, then for us that's a good way of actually managing that standard. Again, maybe not every single accessibility expert would agree with us, but that's a pragmatic solution to that one. But clearly, if you're using an image of text and you're just using an image of text and that's it, then that is something that we see quite a lot.
Yeah, and I like how you're saying, like it's not enough to do that as alt text. It has to be a descriptive text, because alt text is accessible by screen readers, but not everybody is going to use a screen reader. It could be just something like scaling down, even on your mobile phone, and then you can't read the text. So, and if you don't have an alt text reader, then you don't know what's on the image.
So you're only really sort of including one particular access need that's affected by images of text if you put it in the alternative text. And quite often, they can be very detailed descriptions. So, you can't always put it in, depending on which authoring tool you're using, whether you have, whether you're able to put that information anyway. But yeah.
If you do that, you don't need the alt text though, because that's a double thing. It will be read out twice.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
So we tend to put in the alt text. It's just described, wherever we describe it.
Yeah, described. Yeah. Okay. That's been 10, and that's been really helpful. I was expecting a lot of them, and you said that it's not in particular order, because I was like, that could have been my biggest one that I see at least.
Yeah.
But these
What's
are
the
quite
biggest
common.
one you see then?
I was thinking of the images of text.
Okay.
I see a lot of that. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
At least in my circles. So yeah.
Okay. Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. So thank you, Susie. That was really helpful.
Right.
And you mentioned that you are turning your book into kind of a course. You're already running training, but you are launching a course soon. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about that?
Yes, I'd love to. Yes. Yeah. So it's really kind of trying to make the book come alive. So that idea of it's a really, well, hopefully a helpful reference book, but this kind of training, sort of turning that into a kind of live training course. Then I realized just how much more there is, and how examples can be really helpful, and stories that bring it to life. So that was the kind of idea behind turning the book into an online self-access course, really. So so we're basically that's going to be launched in the autumn. That's due to be launched, but we're releasing for Global Accessibility Awareness Day, we're releasing a taster module that has kind of 7 free lessons in it, so you can kind of have a look at again, kind of set myself a high bar in saying, accessible learning content really is fantastic and better learning content. So I've kind of tried to walk the walk and talk the talk and really make it as accessible as possible, but still interactive, still engaging. So so it's basically based on the e-learning framework in the book. So each of the modules is kind of one of the steps in the framework, and it just gives you an example of what the content will be like. So, and it's a great opportunity for us as well to get feedback from people, not only on is it a good piece of learning for you, but also actually if you have got any access needs, if you do use assistive technology, are we making sure that we've in our accessibility statement, have we covered everything? Have we tried to make it as accessible as we possibly can? Because there's always things that as you say, we've been in our discussions today, I'm sure when you're interpreting those standards, there's always things that you're not 100% sure about. You can only do your best. So I'm sure there's people will maybe disagree with what we've been saying, because that's the kind of nature of accessibility. So the idea of having an opportunity to get feedback from people who are actually using it is what is really valuable for us. So obviously it will then, anything that we find out will then feed into the actual the course itself, the program itself when it's launched. So it's a really great opportunity to get.
Is it open for everybody, or is there a limit on?
No, it's fine.
Okay.
It's so basically, you can just sign up to get the free taste. I can send you the link to that, and you can just sign up for the course. Yeah, and then that will we'll actually release that to celebrate Global Accessibility Awareness Day. So I think you said that was your launch as well, wasn't it? So lots of things always happening on that day
as well. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, definitely. I'll share the link as well with this video.
Okay,
and thank you so much for joining me. And if people want to reach out to you, they can visit. They can find you on LinkedIn or through your website.
Ella Hub, www.ellahub.net. So that's and then LinkedIn as well, or Susi at ellahub.net as well. Will find me. Okay.
Thank you so much, Susi. That was a pleasure, and I've got so much out of it.
Okay, it was lovely to talk to you.
Okay.
Right, take care.
Bye.